I don't think Days Gone is really a story about surviving the apocalypse. I think it's a story of one broken man slowly learning that he actually wants to live again. When we first meet Deacon St. John, he's already survived something that killed almost everyone else. By this time, he can outrun freakers and destroy hordes and survive ambushes, but none of that is Deacon's real struggle. His real struggle is much simpler. He survived when the person that he loved didn't, or at least that's what he believes, and he has absolutely no idea what to do with the life he has left. That's why I think Days Gone is often remembered for the wrong things. Most people remember the massive hordes and hauling ass around on your motorcycle, dodging freakers and ambushers, and understandably so, because those are the spectacular moments the game was built and marketed around. But underneath all of that is a much quieter story about grief, healing, and redemption. The apocalypse is really just the environment in which the story takes place, because the heart of Days Gone is the transformation of Deacon St. John from a man who has essentially given up on living into someone who slowly discovers that he still has people and eventually an entire community worth living for. And strangely enough, that transformation may have begun with the most painful decision Deacon had ever made, putting Sarah on that Nero helicopter and staying behind. Before I continue, I'd like to mention that with any topic going into a character arc like this, it may contain spoilers for people who haven't completed the game, so I just wanted to let everybody know up front. In many ways, Deacon's journey mirrors the structure of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, but with an important difference. Traditional heroes willingly, or at least inevitably, answer the call to adventure because they believe they can change the world. Deacon rejects that role almost from the very beginning. He's cynical, distrustful, emotionally exhausted, and has little interest in becoming anyone's savior. Rather than embracing a higher purpose, he spends most of the game trying to survive another day. That reluctance is precisely what makes his character so compelling. His journey isn't about discovering that he has extraordinary abilities. It's about rediscovering his own humanity after years of believing it died alongside the woman he loved. When we first meet Deacon, it's immediately clear that he isn't driven by hope or ambition. His days have settled into a predictable routine. A typical day for Deacon consists of scavenging for supplies, completing bounties, and doing whatever is necessary to survive until tomorrow. At first glance, he appears to be adapting remarkably well to a life after the collapse of civilization, but the more time we spend with him, the more we realize that survival isn't the same thing as living. Every decision he makes is rooted in the past rather than in the future. He isn't building a new life because in his mind there's no future worth building. He's simply enduring one more day in a world that no longer feels like home. One of the earliest things Days Gone establishes is that Deacon isn't simply mourning Sarah. He's unable to move beyond her loss. He continues wearing his wedding ring, visits the memorial where he believes she died, and speaks to her as if she could still hear him. On the surface, those moments seem deeply romantic, reinforcing the image of a husband refusing to forget the love of his life. But beneath the devotion lies something much sadder. Deacon has built his entire identity around a moment he can't change. Letting go of Sarah would require accepting that the life they planned together is gone forever, and that's a reality he simply isn't prepared to face. His grief has become more than an emotion, it's become the foundation of who he is. This is where the hero's journey quietly begins to emerge. Campbell describes the early stages of the hero's path as the refusal of the call, a point where the protagonist resists change because remaining in the familiar feels safer than stepping into the unknown. Deacon embodies that stage almost perfectly. The difference is that his refusal isn't directed towards adventure, it's directed towards healing. He refuses to imagine a future without Sarah because doing so would feel like betraying the memory of the person that he loved. Instead of moving forward, he chooses to remain emotionally frozen, carrying his grief with him everywhere he goes like another piece of equipment strapped onto his motorcycle. One of the most brilliant but subtle storytelling devices in Days Gone is something not many players ever consciously think about: Deacon's motorcycle. Most people see it as transportation or perhaps the game's defining gameplay mechanic, but symbolically it represents something much deeper. Throughout history, motorcycles have often represented freedom, independence, and escape, yet for Deacon, they become a way to avoid standing still long enough to confront his own emotions. As long as he's riding towards another mission or a bounty or another camp, he never has to sit with his grief for very long. The motorcycle keeps him physically moving across Oregon's highways and forests, but emotionally he remains parked on the rooftop at the hospital where he watched Sarah's helicopter disappear into the distance. Interestingly, the game's most meaningful conversations almost always happen after Deacon gets off the bike, whether he's sitting beside Boozer, reconnecting with Sarah, or quietly reflecting at her memorial. His greatest moments of personal growth occur when the constant movement finally stops. That's not accidental. It reinforces the idea that real healing doesn't happen while we're running away from our pain. It begins only when we're willing to face it. One aspect of Deacon's story that I don't think gets discussed nearly enough is the decision that he made to put Sarah on the Nero helicopter. At first, it feels like the greatest mistake of his life because it's the moment that separates them and ultimately convinces Deacon that she's dead. But looking back after finishing the game, I can't help wondering if it was also the most important sacrifice he ever made. Had Deacon climbed aboard that helicopter with Sarah, it's entirely possible they would have stayed together, but I also have a hard time imagining him quietly accepting life inside a military-controlled refugee camp. Throughout the game, Deacon consistently resists authority, questioning leadership and refusing to let other people dictate his decisions. Those traits make him an excellent survivor, but they also make it difficult to imagine him settling into the structured environment that eventually allows Sarah to resume her scientific research. More likely, he would have been determined to leave, and given his fiercely protective nature, I suspect he would have wanted Sarah to leave with him. Had that happened, she might never have found the laboratory or had the equipment or the stability she needed to keep studying the virus. Ironically, the very act that broke Deacon's heart may have been the decision that gave Sarah the best chance to eventually start researching a cure. By the time Deacon finally finds her again, the situation has changed in ways that neither of them could have predicted. Sarah is no longer a frightened survivor clinging to the hope of rescue. She has established herself as an indispensable researcher within the militia. She's also built very important relationships and gained access to the resources she needs and found a purpose that extends far beyond her own survival. Because of that, Deacon doesn't react the way he probably would have during the early days of the outbreak. Instead of insisting they leave immediately, he gradually comes to understand why she has stayed. He recognizes that her work matters, and more importantly, he begins to see that the woman he loves has found something worth fighting for. In a subtle but meaningful way, that realization marks another stage in Deacon's own redemption. Earlier in the story, his instinct would have been to protect Sarah by taking her away from danger, and now he chooses to support the purpose she has discovered, even when it means putting his own desires aside. It's one of the clearest examples of how much he has grown since the day he watched that helicopter disappear into the sky. If there's a single moment where Deacon's redemption truly begins, I don't think it's when he learns Sarah might still be alive. It begins much earlier, in my opinion, when Boozer's injuries forced the two of them to abandon the isolation that they've created on O'Leary Mountain and seek help from the people that they've spent years avoiding. Up until that point, Deacon's world had become incredibly small. It consisted of himself, Boozer, and the routines they had developed simply to survive another day. Living apart from the camps allowed Deacon to avoid responsibility. Also, it allowed him to avoid emotional attachments and, most importantly, avoid the possibility of losing anyone else that he cared about. Solitude had become his defense mechanism, but Boozer's condition shattered the illusion that the two of them could survive on their own forever. For perhaps the first time since Sarah had flew away on the helicopter, Deacon had to place trust in other people, even if every instinct told him not to. That decision gradually reconnects him with the community of Lost Lake, and although he would never admit it, the people there began changing him long before he realizes it himself. At first, every trip to the camp feels purely transactional. He's there to earn credits and gather supplies and make sure that Boozer has what he needs. Yet the more time he spends around Iron Mike, Ricky, Addie, and the rest of the camp, the harder it becomes to maintain the emotional distance he'd spent 2 years constructing. He begins taking on responsibilities that extend beyond his own survival, rescuing strangers and defending people who can't offer him anything in return. None of these choices feel heroic in the traditional sense, and that's precisely what makes them meaningful. Deacon never sets out to become a leader or a savior. He simply keeps making one decent decision after another until, almost without realizing it, he becomes someone the community begins to depend on. This is also the point where his journey begins to mirror the classic hero's journey, albeit in a way that feels remarkably grounded. Campbell wrote that every hero eventually crosses a threshold into a new world, leaving behind the safety of what they knew in order to embrace a greater purpose. For Deacon, that threshold isn't marked by a triumphant speech or a dramatic declaration. It arrives quietly, almost reluctantly, as he discovers that caring about other people again is every bit as frightening as fighting a horde of freakers. Opening himself up to the possibility of friendship, trust, and community also means opening himself up to the possibility of loss, and after everything that's happened to Sarah, that may be the hardest battle he ever fights. As the threats surrounding Lost Lake continue to grow, first the Rippers and later the revelation that Sarah may still be alive, Deacon's motivations begin evolving in subtle but important ways. What started as a desperate attempt to keep Boozer alive slowly becomes something much larger. His journey south to Crater Lake is driven by a hope of finding Sarah, but even that search reflects how much he's already changed. Earlier in the story, Deacon was fighting only for the past, clinging to the memory of the life that he had lost. By the time he reaches Wizard Island, he's become someone capable of fighting for the future instead. That transformation ultimately reaches its peak when he unites the survivors from multiple camps, stands against Colonel Garrett's militia, and risks everything not for revenge or personal gain, but to protect a community that has become his home. The reluctant drifter who once believed he had nothing left to lose has quietly become the very kind of leader he spent the entire game insisting he could never be. And that seems to be the most fitting conclusion to Deacon St. John's journey. The reluctant drifter who spent 2 years believing there was nothing left worth saving ends the story surrounded by people who are alive because he refused to give up on them. He doesn't run off alone into the wilderness as the lone biker we met at the beginning of the game. Instead, he remains at Lost Lake with Sarah, Boozer, and the community that now has a genuine chance to build something better together. The apocalypse hasn't ended, the freakers are still out there, and Nero's final revelation makes it clear that an even greater challenge lies ahead. But for the first time since Sarah's helicopter disappeared over the horizon, Deacon isn't merely surviving in the world that remains, he's helping to shape the world that comes next. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a like and think about subscribing to the channel. And as always, I'll see you on the next one.